Yeah, this is in a way similar to what happened when the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham or Syria established its caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. And all of a sudden, there were attacks in Paris and Brussels, as you will recall. They were inspiring, directing, supporting in various ways these attacks that were well outside the actual caliphate. And of course, the Islamic State Khorasan group, ISIS-K or ISK, has really nothing like the kind of caliphate in Afghanistan and really the surrounding areas, because keep in mind that the Khorasan actually refers to other countries that are literally around Afghanistan as well, and certainly Pakistan among them and some of the Central Asian states. But nonetheless, they were able apparently to orchestrate this attack. And according to various news reports, the FSB, the Internal Security Service in Russia, actually seems to have detained some other individuals before they were able to carry out attacks that they apparently intended to conduct. So this is indeed what happens when an organization takes over an area where there used to be pretty good security against the extremists, at the very least. We did a lot to whittle down the Islamic State in Afghanistan before we left. And of course, we never allowed al-Qaeda to reestablish a sanctuary there either. But now they're able to move around Afghanistan reasonably well. They carry out periodic suicide and other attacks inside Afghanistan on a fairly regular basis. So this is a real worry, and we'll see if they can stretch the reach that they have established here. Again, going all the way to Moscow is pretty significant, and it's very likely that they've recruited some from the Central Asian states who speak Russian and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, General, this attack so far, we've seen Russia attacked, Iran attacked, but is this a warning to the West, and what should the West now do?
Well, first of all, I think that the West, at least in the case of the United States, seems to have pretty good insights, as we say, into what the Islamic State Khorasan group is trying to do. And of course, that was why we reportedly twice shared intelligence with Russian counterparts, and why the public warning was issued by the embassy against assembling in large groups. So clearly there was a sense that something was about to happen. And that obviously is a result of what has been gathered and then analyzed from various sources and methods, most likely.
The United States, as you say, warned Russia twice, and that warning was ignored. I guess, the question then is, what should Russia have done? Because you, of course, were the former director of the CIA. You know all too well about this duty to warn, and you would have, when you were director, given those sorts of details and intelligence to the Russians. Has the relationship become so bad that something like this can occur and warnings are just ignored?
Well, I don't know that we can presume that they were ignored without knowing really what they did when the information was shared with them. And you're right to highlight the duty to warn. And you warn your adversaries as well as your friends. That's the nature of this. And this clearly is a representation of that. But without knowing what they did, and again, probably a relatively general sharing of information, it's hard to assess, I think. And I don't know that we should say that they ignored them. One would think that the FSB in particular would have been pulling out all the stops. And indeed, they did actually detain some other individuals before they were able to carry out attacks in recent weeks.
And yet we're seeing Vladimir Putin and various others from the Kremlin pointing the finger of blame at the Ukrainians.
Well, that's a convenient artifice here. If they acknowledge that this was the Islamic State, it's a huge black eye and a terrible loss attributable to the failure of their internal security service. So far better, again, to blame it on the Ukrainians, on the supposed Nazis that run the government in Ukraine, never matter that one of them is Jewish. Again, this is their MO. This is how Vladimir Putin operates. You note he was very slow to even appear publicly after the attack. and once again, very convenient to lay this at the doorstep of Ukraine, although it's quite clear from all the open source information that Ukraine had nothing to do with this. And Ukraine did indeed deny it as well. And I, again,
in your view, though, does it expose the sort of weakness of Russia's intelligence agencies?
Well, it does. Again, I'd like to know more detail about how close they came. What you really need. This is the kind of event after which there should be a very substantial inquiry, and ultimately the results should be made public. That will not be the case here. There will be excuses. There will be blame on Ukraine and others. There will not be the acceptance of responsibility that you have seen in the wake of intelligence failures in other countries.
How worried are you about ISIS in Iraq and Syria?
Well, the key there is for American forces to stay in Iraq, northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and also a little tiny corner of Jordan, which is a support base for some of the elements that are at Al-Tanf inside Syria. That's very, very important. The Iraqi security forces really are quite good, especially their counterterrorism service. They're really quite capable, but they don't have the intelligence resources that we have. And virtually no country in the world has the ability to fuse intelligence the way the United States, arguably the UK, and a few others can do. That's the real art in all of this. And bringing together dissimilar data sets, fusing all of them, and pulling the needle out of the digital haystack is a real challenge for most countries. And so that's what we're doing for Iraq. We also do provide some intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets reportedly as well.
Do you think that the United States will find itself in a position where it is working very closely with Russia, Iran, and say the Taliban on counterterrorism?
I don't know how closely that could be, but again, given the duty to warn and given the fact that this is a common threat to all and something that we don't want to see metastasize further, this is a pretty good distance from the location where they're most operating, again, in and around Afghanistan. Very substantial operation in that regard. I must say I'm a little bit puzzled, though, that this was not a suicide attack. I can't remember too many of this kind of attack by the Islamic State where the operatives didn't go down in a blaze of glory. The fact that they were actually captured strikes me as a little bit odd. I would have thought they might have had a suicide vest on and with their last act take a bunch of the Russians with them. But perhaps they literally just couldn't fashion those. They couldn't get them through whatever security they feared might apprehend them. But no question about the Islamic State. They actually acknowledged it. They claimed credit for it. They don't do that. And then there are some other indicators that I've seen in open source information that indicate that certain channels that are watched by some groups in Pakistan were opened up right at the time that this operation was being conducted.
Well, the United States, for some time now, has made it clear that its focus is great power competition with the likes of China and Russia. I guess this also, though, brings attention back to this idea that the sort of age of holy terror is over.
Not at all. In fact, many of us, I have repeatedly stressed that even after you destroy an extremist group, and that means render it incapable of accomplishing its mission without reconstitution, which is what we did to al-Qaeda in Iraq, the forerunner of the Islamic State, during the surge in Iraq, and then kept it down for another 3.5 years until our combat forces withdrew and the Iraqi security forces took their eye off them. And the next thing you know, a couple of years later, you have the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. The lesson there is that you have to keep an eye and pressure on these kinds of groups, even when they're down to remnants. And that is what indeed our forces are seeking to do and are doing with the Iraqi security forces, especially, again, with its counterterrorism service. So you have to keep after that. And if I can just point out also, the U.S. and its allies and partners have to keep more plates spinning right now, if you regard threats and challenges as plates in the circus tent, if you will, than I think at any time, at least since the end of the Cold War. And many of those plates represent more complex challenges. Certainly, the biggest plate in the tent, the one that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China, is exceedingly complex. But you still do have not only Russia and North Korea and several Iran plates, a nuclear plate, the missiles and drone plate, support to Shia militias in Iraq and in Lebanon and Yemen and so forth, not to mention Hamas. But there are still plates that represent the different groups. So there's still an Al-Qaeda plate. It's much diminished. There's still clearly an Islamic State Khorasan group. There's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, still down in Yemen. There's in East and North and Northwest Africa, there are extremist groups. And I'm very concerned there because of the French withdrawal from Mali and now the Niger asking the U.S. to vacate that many tens of millions of dollars base that has been so important for these intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft over that part of that continent. So you do have to keep an eye and pressure on them, or they will reconstitute. This lesson has been learned the hard way over and over and again.
And just briefly, General, I want to just take your attention to the Middle East. And of course, I know that you've just returned from Israel. At the beginning of this conflict, you went to Israel, you spoke to them, you warned them, you told them, look, be careful about going in without an actual strategy, because we've dealt with this in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Have some kind of strategy and an exit strategy and think about the day after before you go in. In your conversations now, and just to analyze what you think of the current situation, given we've seen over 30,000 Palestinians killed, the hostages, all of them, haven't been released, Hamas hasn't been destroyed, and we've now seen this fracture in relationships between Israel and the United States, and many blaming the United States for being too close to Israel when it's come to this conflict.
Well, let me just first note, the trauma that Israel sustained has to really be appreciated. This is the equivalent. Remember, we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. This would be the equivalent of us losing 42,000 and having 7,000 more taken hostage. So start with that as a departure point. And then I do agree with Israel. They do have to destroy Hamas. And again, that means you have to render them incapable of accomplishing their mission without reconstitution. Keep your eye on that, because the plan to prevent reconstitution is not yet fully fleshed out. Witness that they had to go back into the Al-Shifa hospital and clear it again because the hold phase of that was not sufficient. But there's 4 or 5 Hamas battalions left out of the original 24 that have not yet been defeated. And they're obviously in the south, but surrounded by 1.1 million displaced civilians. So it's a very, very challenging. And indeed, this whole context is the most fiendishly difficult urban operation imaginable, far tougher than what we dealt with in places like Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, Mosul, parts of Baghdad, and so forth, when we were destroying Al-Qaeda, soon to be the Islamic State. And so the key here is that once you have actually dealt with what initially were almost similar to conventional units, Hamas companies, battalions, brigades. As they are defeated, they break down into what are essentially insurgent guerrilla terrorist groups. And you have to really conduct a counterinsurgency campaign. And we didn't get this right for many years in Iraq, as you'll recall. It was not until the surge that we finally started doing urban operations properly, where you clear and hold an area. In Fallujah, I think we created something like 12 gated communities, we called them, with entry control points, and no one could get in or out without a biometric ID card and so forth. So that once you cleared it, you kept it clear, and then you can rebuild it, restore basic services, repair the damage, and all the rest of that, get markets, schools, clinics all going again. And it's this aspect of this operation that is most challenging, because Israel, I don't think, has quite the force density that is required for that without some fairly considerable fortifications, if you will. I mean, I think it would be worth examining, at the very least, just walling off the northern part of Gaza and then having a couple of entry control points, biometric ID cards, all the tactics, techniques, and procedures that ultimately we came to learn in practice during the surge when we did clear Fallujah finally the right way and have kept it clear for many years after that, Ramadi and these others that I mentioned. This is far, far more difficult. 350 miles of subterranean complex tunnels and so forth. An enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, uses humans as shields, holds still over 130 or so hostages. And now you have the problem of all the displaced civilians around it as well. But I do believe they have to destroy it. Benny Gantz, part of the war cabinet, former Minister of Defense and Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, and a good friend, said you don't send the fire department to put out 70 or 80% of the blaze. You need to take it all out.
So do you think they should go into Rafah?
I do think they have to, but you have to do it the right way. They have to destroy Hamas, but how you do that, and this is what I believe the U.S. administration is voicing concerns about, to show us the plan for how you're going to move 1.1 million displaced people to another area in Gaza, because they're obviously not going to leave Gaza, and then to isolate that battlefield. And by the way, the Israelis have spectacular biometric skills and talent, and they have mined all of these videos and all the rest of that the extremists uploaded, showing the atrocities of 10/7 and their barbarian conduct. And they're now picking these guys up in many cases with that kind of technology. But I do think they have to go in there, but they've got to get them out, and they've got to get obviously a huge amount of humanitarian assistance in there to take care of these people who are in some cases on the verge of starvation.
General, would you agree, though, that the death toll has just been too high?
Look, Yalda, I find it really difficult to second guess folks, having been second guessed a number of times when I was commanding different wars at different ranks. And if I don't, without knowing the specific target, the necessity, the military necessity, how hard they work. Look, they send text messages, drop leaflets, they warn, all of this. But certainly the civilian casualties have been substantial, and it's absolutely imperative to keep them to a minimum going forward. Ultimately, there really should be a vision for Gaza, and frankly for the West Bank as well, that we are going to make life better for you by getting Hamas out of your midst. That's what we did before going again into Fallujah, Ramadi, and these others. We would tell the people, we are going to get Al-Qaeda and the Sunni insurgents out of your communities, and life is going to be much better as a result. And I'd love to hear that kind of commitment, and then the demonstration of the concern for those people, again, ensuring the humanitarian assistance gets in there in very large numbers, and obviously minimizing to the greatest extent possible loss of innocent civilian life in the conduct of the operation. But they have to go in there and they have to do this. They cannot allow that to stay. But then the issue is, Yalda, how do they hold the areas that they have cleared? And as I've mentioned, you can literally wall them off and do this, and that reduces the numbers that you need for that. Then they're going to have to get local partners on the ground. This is inevitable.
But
they're going to have to get local security forces.
The plan you're currently seeing, are you satisfied that they're able to go into Rafah and not increase the civilian deaths and be able to move the population to a safer area and ground and be able to conduct this operation in the manner that you're talking about?
Well, I haven't seen the plan. I was in there several weeks ago. I met with Minister of Defense Gallant, also with his deputy, and then separately with his policy director as well. And I don't know that they had that plan right then, and I certainly haven't been privy. And that's what I believe the U.S. was hoping that National Security Advisor Ron Dermer and others were going to bring back this week, but that trip has been canceled because of the U.S. vote on the UN Security Council resolution.
Do you then believe that Israel should remain in Gaza for the long haul?
I believe that Israel is going to have to ensure security for the long haul. And initially, I think there's no alternative to the Israeli Defense Forces doing that. But that's why I was mentioning earlier, as soon as they can, they need to get local partners on the ground. Now, that's not going to be easy, given the support for Hamas that we see in polls and everything else. But that's why there has to be a real campaign to say, we're committed to making your lives better. Here's how we're going to do that. Work with us if you would, at least don't work against us. And keep in mind that the reason your lives are so miserable right now is because of what Hamas visited on innocent Israelis on 10/7 in such horrific numbers in such horrific ways. But no, they're going to have to do that, I think, for a while. Then the question is, what alternatives might there be? And again, by the way, contractors can do an awful lot of some of this work. They're not going to carry out offensive operations, but they can do fixed site security. In fact, you'll recall we also reconciled with over 100,000 of the rank and file Sunni insurgents and Shia militia members during the surge in Iraq, and basically got them working for us. So there will have to be these kinds of activities.
I guess you've also seen how populations have become radicalized. And when we've seen over 11,000 children now become orphans, and when we're told that, by the IDF that something like 10 to 12,000 of those they've killed from the death toll are Hamas operatives, that leaves 18,000 of those or more, civilians. Don't you worry then that those people and those children could become radicalized as a result of this conflict?
Yes, it's a real worry. I just saw a poll recently that also showed the enormous percentage of families that have lost a family member, someone related to them. So yeah, this is all the more reason to expeditiously commit to making their lives better and beginning the process of trying to develop a working relationship. I don't think that they can just pull out of these communities and encircle Gaza and hermetically seal it, which they're going to do, of course, down even with the Rafah crossing into Egypt. They're going to interpose themselves there, and I agree with that. And certainly controlling this in a way that they have not before. But what's going on in the population? You can't deal with this just with targeted raids. This is not a counterterrorism campaign. There are elements of counterterrorism here, clearly, and you use your high-end counterterrorism units for the high-value targets that you're going after. But you need a presence on the ground in the communities, living with the people, and again, gated communities so that you can actually keep them clear of the bad guys with a variety of different tactics, techniques, and procedures to enable that. And this is, again, now much more of a counterinsurgency campaign than it is a conventional military endeavor. So the sooner that is crafted, that is announced, and then, of course, start looking for how they can thin out, how they can get actual partners on the ground, how they can ensure that education is reformed and they're de-radicalized to the extent that they can. But certainly, look, hearts and minds do matter in this stuff. And the sooner there's that kind of commitment, I think, the better. But remember what I said earlier, destruction, the military doctrine term, means rendering the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. They have to focus on preventing reconstitution, even if they control, again, the borders of Gaza and control nothing more coming in that is nefarious. There are stockpiles in there, I'm sure, that can enable a festering insurgency to continue and perhaps even allow the reconstitution of some of these companies and battalions of Hamas.
General Petraeus, good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Yalda.